Somewhere on the west coast of Africa, in the early 1700s, there was a king. He looked around at his small kingdom, hemmed in on all sides by rivals, squeezed by a powerful empire to the east, ignored by the European traders anchoring off his coast. And he made a decision. Not out of cruelty, not out of madness. Out of survival. That decision would build one of the most powerful armies in African history. It would send hundreds of thousands of human beings across the Atlantic Ocean in chains. And it would eventually destroy everything he built. This is the story of the Kingdom of Dahomey. A kingdom that didn't just participate in the slave trade. A kingdom that turned it into an empire. To understand Dahomey, you have to understand the world it was born into. West Africa in the 1600s was not a place of simple tribes and empty land. It was a sophisticated, complex web of kingdoms, empires, trade routes, and rival powers, some of which had been thriving for centuries before any European ever set foot on the continent. Dahomey began as a small inland kingdom in what is today the country of Benin. It had no coastline, no direct access to the booming Atlantic trade. To its east sat the Oyo Empire, one of the largest and most powerful states in all of West Africa, and Dahomey paid them tribute, every year, like a tax, like submission. Meanwhile, along the coast, something was happening that was changing everything. European ships, Portuguese, Dutch, British, French, were anchoring offshore. And they wanted one thing. People. The Atlantic slave trade was already underway, and the kingdoms with coastal access were getting rich, not from farming or craftsmanship, but from selling their neighbors. In exchange, they received guns, gunpowder, iron, textiles, alcohol. And guns in 17th century West Africa meant power. Dahomey watched all of this from the inside. Landlocked, paying tribute, falling behind. And then a new king came to power. His name was Agaja. And he had a plan. King Agaja came to power in 1718. He was not a man who accepted the situation he was handed. In 1724, he launched a military campaign against the neighboring coastal kingdom of Alada. In 1727, he took Wida, one of the busiest slave ports in all of West Africa. Just like that, Dahomey had the coast. Now here is where the history gets complicated and uncomfortable. Because Agaja didn't conquer these kingdoms to end the slave trade. He conquered them to control it. Historians have debated his motivations for centuries. Some believe he genuinely wanted to stop the selling of his people, that he saw the trade as destructive and wanted to redirect West African economies toward goods instead of humans. Others point to what actually happened next. Dahomey became the single most active slave trading state on the entire West African coast. The logic was brutal and it was rational. This region had entered what historians call the gun-slave cycle. To get guns, you sold slaves. To get slaves, you needed guns for raids. To fund raids, you needed more slaves. And on it went, a trap that locked every kingdom into the same choice. Enslave others or be enslaved. Dahomey chose the former. And it built an entire state around that choice. What Dahomey built was not just a kingdom. It was a machine. Every year, Dahomey's army would set out on what they called the annual customs, large-scale military raids on surrounding peoples. Captives were taken, villages emptied, families torn apart. The prisoners would then be marched, sometimes hundreds of miles, to the port at Ouida. There they were held in barracoons, large holding pens, sometimes for weeks. And then they were loaded onto ships. At its peak, more than 15,000 people were being shipped out of Ouida every single year. Let that number sit for a moment. 15,000 people every year. Gone across the ocean into a system most would not survive. In return, Dahomey received European firearms, the most advanced weapons on the continent. And those weapons made their army nearly unstoppable in the region. The most extraordinary part of that army was one most people have never heard of. The Agoji, known in the West as the Dahomey Amazons, an all-female military regiment, up to 6,000 soldiers, who served as the king's personal guard and frontline shock troops. They were not a ceremonial unit. They were trained killers feared across the region. European visitors who encountered them in battle described them as more disciplined, more ferocious, and more effective than their male counterparts. The Agaja raided, they captured, they enforced. They were the human engine of Dahomey's economy. And that economy, by the 18th century, was almost entirely built on human beings. Dahomey didn't grow rich from gold, or salt, or agriculture. It grew rich from people. In 1807, Britain abolished the transatlantic slave trade. And then it did something remarkable. It sent its navy to enforce that decision on everyone else. British warships began patrolling the West African coast, intercepting slave ships, freeing captives, pressuring coastal kingdoms to stop the trade entirely. For Dahomey, this was a crisis. The entire economic foundation of the kingdom, the trade that had funded its army, its kings, its ceremonies, its power, was being choked off. Dahomey tried to adapt. Around 1840, King Agaja began shifting toward palm oil exports, keeping enslaved people to work the land instead of selling them abroad. It was a transition, but it was never complete, and the revenue never matched what the slave trade had provided. Meanwhile, the military was weakening. New enemies rose. The Yoruba city-state of Abeokuta, itself a kingdom built partly in response to Dahomey's raids, began defeating Dahomey in battle. The kingdom that had spent a century taking other people's people was now losing its own. And then came France. In 1890, the French Empire, expanding aggressively across West Africa, issued an ultimatum to Dahomey. Recognize French sovereignty, pay tribute, submit. King Behenzin refused. He mobilized his army, including the Agaja. And Dahomey went to war with France. It was no contest. French forces had rifles, machine guns, artillery. Dahomey's warriors, even the legendary Agaja, fell in enormous numbers. By 1894, it was over. Behenzin was captured, exiled to Martinique. The Kingdom of Dahomey, which had survived for over 2 centuries, was dissolved. Absorbed into French West Africa. Erased from the map. The very European powers that Dahomey had traded with, armed itself through, and built its empire upon, had consumed it in the end. So what do we make of Dahomey? It is easy and tempting to look at this history and assign simple labels. Villain, monster, evil. But history rarely gives us the luxury of simple labels. Dahomey did not invent the slave trade. It entered a system already in motion, a system built on European demand, European ships, and European capital. A system that had been running for over a century before Dahomey ever controlled a single port. Dahomey looked at that system and made a choice. Not the right choice, not a moral choice, but a choice that made a brutal kind of sense in a world where the alternative was to become the commodity yourself. That doesn't make it acceptable. It makes it human. And here is the final piece of this story. The modern nation of Benin, which sits on the same land where Dahomey once stood, has formally apologized for its ancestors' role in the slave trade. It is one of the only nations in history to have done so. The descendants of those who were sold are scattered across the Americas, the Caribbean, Brazil. Many of them will never know where their families came from, or that the kingdom that sent them away eventually paid the same price it had imposed on others. History doesn't always deliver justice. But sometimes, if you look closely enough, it delivers something almost as unsettling. A mirror